Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 199. How do you customize a LLM chatbot to address a collection of documents and data? What tools and techniques can you use to build embeddings into a vector database? This week on the show, Calvin Hendryx-Parker is back to discuss developing an AI-powered, large language model-driven chat interface. Calvin is the founder and CTO of 6 Feet Up, a Python and AI consultancy. He shares a recent project for a family-owned seed company that wanted to build a tool for customers to access years of farm research. These documents were stored as brochure-style PDFs and spanned 50 years. We discuss several of the tools used to augment an LLM. Calvin covers working with LangChain and vectorizing data with ChromaDB. We talk about the obstacles and limitations of capturing documentation. Calvin also shares a smaller project that you can try out yourself. It takes the information from a conference website and creates a chatbot using Django and Python prompt-toolkit. This episode is sponsored by Mailtrap, an email delivery platform that developers love. Try for free at mailtrap.io. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Calvin, welcome back.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's fun. It seems like our annual visit.
Yeah, I've gotten used to it.
Yeah, cool. So you reached out and had talked about some new projects that you're doing there at 6 Feet Up, and one of them is working with this customer named Beck's Hybrids. And maybe you can tell me a little bit about the project, and then we can kind of dig in, because I'm very interested in this idea of building chatbots and using a lot of these AI tools and LLMs, but also the idea of customizing them for, in this case, a business client or a specific domain. I think that's fascinating.
So the client specifically is Beck's Hybrids. They're the largest family-owned seed company in the United States.
Wow.
And so when you drive through the Midwest, you'll very frequently see these signs along the roads, like big Beck's logo and some kind of number underneath. A lot of those are the Beck's test farms. So they have farms all across the Midwest where all they're doing is understanding how their hybrids react in various areas and trying to develop these things that are better fits for one area versus another. And they have, agronomists and all these people who are collecting all that research and putting into these tomes that they call practical farm research. And they send those out to their customers. So all the farmers who is a customer of Beck's, which is a lot of them all over the place, get these big books called Practical Farm Research, and it'll be all of the things they learned from last year. Again, I'm not an agronomist, so I may not do it justice, but how do you answer questions like, when's the best time to plant a cover crop? Or when should I harvest, X, Y, or Z? Or when do I lay down this kind of a herbicide versus another? Because it's all the kind of things they've included in this research over time.
Sounds like a really cool modern version of a almanac, farmer's almanac, with way more detailed.
Oh, it's way more detailed is the thing. I think it's chock full of graphs and charts and diagrams and data and tables and images and pictures. So and that's what's interesting about that data is that there's a lot of data in there.
Yeah.
But it's very unstructured. If you were to say, I wanted to be able to use this with an AI model, for right now, the world has come a long way in the last 18 months when it comes to ChatGPT only releasing November 2022. And this project was done in the summer of 2023. These were early days for this kind of thing. But now you can go to OpenAI and sign up for ChatGPT and actually build your own GPT and put it in the marketplace. So you could upload your own PDF sets of this kind of data into there and get some ability to do this.
Okay.
But if your PDFs are not well structured, for example, this is how I kind of kick off when I talk about this specific project, is that the real magic of doing this project was, how do you get the right data into the right format and the right spot so that it makes sense to a human and also to an AI who's trying to give you the next statistically probable word that is going to answer whatever question you just gave it.
Yeah.
Because that's really, we've not progressed to AGI. Yeah, I mean, we're still in a generative AI world where it's still statistics and math that are kind of ruling what these models are giving us on the side. So the data in these PDFs, these practical farm research books, if you think about like their goal was to print a book they would ship to someone.
Right.
And you're using visual indicators to maybe indicate importance on a page. You may be highlighting a row in a table in a specific color, but to a computer, it's just grabbing the text out of that page. It doesn't see the highlight necessarily.
Right.
Or you may want to, as a page designer, maybe using like InDesign or some page layout program, like desktop publishing program, you may be hiding text by dragging it off the page, out into kind of the space around. If you've ever done desktop publishing,
Yeah.
sometimes you'll make a white box to hide something and just put it over text that's on the page, or you may just drag that off to the side because you might need it later, or you don't want to include it in that version of the print. But when you go to export that as a PDF, that text is technically still there. It's just not visible to the human eye.
It's like sort of a hidden layer of.
It's like a hidden layer, but to the parsers that are tearing apart a PDF file, they're going to see those strings of text still in there, and they may be wrong. It may be not accurate information. It may have been a old version of some text that you didn't remove, but you just like put a white box over and put the new text over the top of it. How do you tell OpenAI when you're just uploading a PDF file that's the case in these files? So this is kind of what happened with this specific project. Is that a lot of the magic initially was, how do we parse these PDF files and make sense of them? So actually using other kinds of AI to start with, like not generative AI, but actually using like scikit-learn and some other tools to try and understand the page.
To do the cleaning?
And then clean it up, and then actually extract the text in a meaningful way and be able to assign common patterns that you basically train a model to read the PDF to extract data to be used by another model to give you answers in the generative AI world. So that's a big challenge here.
Yeah. It makes me think about the time I worked for a law firm, and I was basically teaching the staff there how to use all their different tools. And obviously PDFs are a big part of that. And they had this whole massive database document store of that things you would, as a lawyer, you would check out a document and maybe add things to it and check it in, and had to keep version histories. But I thought about the whole redaction, and there are all these really bad methodologies of like, just put a black box over it because it'll print that way, but it's like, not the digital document is not going to have that. You have to really look at the correct tools.
And I guarantee you, if you go out and ask ChatGPT right now for redacted documents, and a lot of them did that technique where it's just a black box over some text, and so that text now can be exposed. You can use the attacks, the various kinds of attacks against that model to have it expose the source text. And we've all seen this. That's what the New York Times was kind of going on about with their thing, is if you perform these attacks, you could get, verbatim word for word text that was actually in the source of these models.
Yeah. It's pretty wild. I think that was something that happened with one of the video game things recently, that there was some legal argument that they had done the same thing. Or they had just maybe used like a marker and you could still see through it, like a Sharpie, and it wasn't like dark enough. Anyway, it's pretty crazy.
Mm-hmm.
This overall technique of adding context to a large language model that is focused on a business has kind of an odd name. I'm guessing the general name is RAG, Retrieval-augmented generation, which is a whole mouthful. But the idea is that you're adding this sort of sidecar store of documents that the LLM can sort of partner with or kind of use. And I was watching kind of a useful video. IBM put a video that kind of explains the process pretty well, that even in the asking questions, it can kind of add context to like make sure that your question is in the right domain. And it can do also kind of interesting things about like adding now a source to the answer, as opposed to like it just sort of magically coming out of this embedding that's in the LLM. Is that some of the reasons that or things that you've noticed as you're building this tool?
Well, that was a major component of the requirements for this specific project, was actually to be able to give them a citation to the physical book they would have on their bookshelf.
Okay.
I think it's more powerful because if they can ask a question to a virtual agronomist about when do I best time to plant a cover crop is, and it's in actually another bit that's missing that I didn't talk about was, in addition to indexing the practical farm research, putting that into the vector store on the side, so that when you ask a question, it goes and finds say the 20 closest documents that are like what you just asked about, and including that in the context. What we also do is when people onboard into the system is ask, and interview the farmer.
Okay.
Where is your farm located? What kind of tractor do you have? What kind of wheels are on your planter?
Huh.
Because those all can factor into, well, you would do this except if you had this kind of tractor, or you would do that except if your
Yeah.
farm is located in Idaho or Illinois or Iowa. So there's contextual answers even inside the practical farm research, and then you want to be able to give them a page number in a book to go like pull it off the shelf, look at it, or you'd want them to contact the right person to talk to. So and in addition to enriching that vector database with the PDF pages from the practical farm research, we also indexed in there, or had a tool with using that. We were using LangChain for
Okay.
the framework for a lot of this piece, was having the tool talk to their company directory. So who covers Iowa for this version of this seed, and so we would know how to actually direct you to a correct person to talk to.
Okay.
Or in this case, hallucinating would be a really bad thing because you don't want to give people direction on your product that would be incorrect or inaccurate. But if we can actually give them citations and the right people to talk to, and we, behind the scenes, I think what is not actually seen by most people doing these kind of projects right now is it's important to actually build in some structure and some frameworks for like observability to the prompts and the questions that people are asking of your system. And we built that into this,
Like logging of sorts.
yeah, like I'll log all the prompts people are asking of your model.
Okay.
And then you can actually have someone who knows what they're talking about review it, kind of like training a large language model, like with a supervised training.
Yeah.
In this case, it's not really supervised training. We're going to take the responses that the generative AI gave, and we may rate them like a 1 to 5 star rating as how good was that response.
Yeah.
And then that gets indexed and potentially sent in as context later when someone asks a very similar question. You can say, well, this was a good response and this was a bad response to this question in this area.
Yeah.
And then the map model can now statistically incorporate that into how it's going to respond in the future. Or you would have a subject matter expert write an official response to a question like that.
Okay. For this is the common question we're going to go ahead and answer.
Right. And so if you think about like FAQs, I mean, FAQs are nice because they're official answers to common questions.
Right.
Well, if you're chatting with a bot, it'd be nice if it could pull from those official answers in a very easy manner in concert with all the other data associated to that question or whatever they're asking in the prompt.
Makes me think of two things. One is, it sounds like the system generally, these sort of augmenting an LLM via the system, has some nice advantages in the sense that you can update your side of that information. You can add the next issue of their study or whatever.
Yeah.
And then one other thing I thought was kind of interesting, I don't know, this is something, I was watching inside that IBM video, which I thought was really kind of cool, is that a system like this can actually say, I don't know, or that information isn't here. Is that your experience?
Yeah, you can say that the context provided, it can understand that in the context you provide it, that nothing was mentioned about whatever the question might be.
Okay.
If I was reversing back in time, trying to think of like how that went. What's interesting, you mentioned like the next edition of like the practical farm research being included.
Yeah.
It's actually, I think, more exciting than that is that the last answer someone asked 5 seconds ago can actually be included as part of the context for the next person who's asking
Really?
for that same thing.
Because it has that context window?
Yeah, as part of the context window, because the data is all going, like if you've not kind of played with LangChain, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing tool, and it's been evolving super, super fast. I mean, when we started the project to when we stopped the project, there's probably only like a 3 or 4 month window I mean, the number of revisions that they were very active. Like,
Yeah.
you had to kind of keep on top of the update notes and release notes for that project. The docs were changing, out from underneath you. Something that was there yesterday is not there today. But that was just because it's so early days. It was a very vibrant project, and they were very active. And I think they still are. But the embedded vector database inside of LangChain is ChromaDB by default,
Okay.
which is like a layer on top of SQLite. And so we would take all the practical farm research, we would rip that apart into what made sense as far as sections, and then you index that into that ChromaDB database so that when someone asks a question, you run the transform against the question, you run the transform against you query the database with that big long index of integers, and you can set up a tuning. So there's lots of that's one nice thing about like these tools. There's lots of areas to kind of knobs you can tune and fiddle and twist. So you can say, I want, adjusting that context window size, how many documents you bring back. So it would not only bring back those documents, but it also we're indexing as we interact with a person chatting with the chatbot. We index those answers and responses back into that database to be used in future sessions with either another user. In this case, there's no privacy information. There shouldn't be anyway. So there shouldn't be any kind of worry about like a bleed over. If I ask the question, it should be safe to be able to answer based on maybe someone ranking that question later to another person in the system.
Okay.
Now, there's definitely ways you can segment this and firewall it off and do other kinds of security things here, but that wasn't the concern for this specific one. The concern is more are giving accurate information.
Yeah.
If it starts giving inaccurate information, can we tell it it's giving inaccurate information? Can that be considered in a response that may happen, minutes from now, and not worry about fine tuning a model? Because there's a couple different ways you can interact with these generative AIs. You can use the foundational models as is, so like ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo, ChatGPT 4,
right?
Or maybe you're using an open source foundational model like Llama 2 or Mistral or one of these other ones. You can use them out of the box as is with the knowledge that they were trained on. You can use them how we use them for the specific Bex project, where you're providing additional context windows, which is basically like, think about it as providing a giant prompt. And at the very end of that giant prompt, you actually just put in the last line of what they actually asked. If you ask a simple one sentence question, it may be preceded by a couple kilobytes of text relevant to it that we found someplace else and included into it. And that's what the RAG part of this is.
Yeah.
You also have the other option of fine tuning your models, where you take all your documentation or all the resources and things all the assets you want to be included as part of the guardrails for what this model can talk about.
Okay.
And you train on top of the existing foundational model with more data. But that requires, GPUs, compute, and time, because you're doing basically the same process they did to build that model initially. You're just taking it and layering on some of your own data on top of it.
Yeah.
But doing that's expensive and time consuming and can't react in real time to people rating or ranking responses better or worse than another response.
This episode is sponsored by Mailtrap, an email delivery platform that developers love. Mailtrap is an email sending solution with industry-best analytics, SMTP, and email API SDKs for major programming languages. And it includes 24/7 human support. Try it out for free at mailtrap.io. That's mailtrap.io. So those additional kind of on-the-fly ratings of things or common questions and so forth, is that information that's just held temporarily in memory, or is it something that gets then saved to a database that is stored?
Yeah, we'll save that to a database. I mean, for this, actually, there's some sample code that you can share with all the listeners. The presentation we did from this summer, it has some examples in there of actually doing this, where we built a simple Django application, like using HTMX as the chat front end, so that we didn't have to build a whole bunch of front end stuff, and just like did the whole nice single web page reactivity aspect was really nice.
Yeah.
The models themselves, are in the Django app as like content or objects inside of the Django database, where you say, this is a ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo.
Okay.
Its temperature is set to X. These other variables that you can kind of those knobs I was talking about.
Right.
You can actually set up those things so that as the API calls happen to your various models, like the foundational models, whether you're using OpenAI or we're hosting it on some other service like Hugging Face Spaces or whatever, you can now like A/B test between different settings that you would be passing along for that API without having to redeploy code.
Okay.
So that you now have that capability of storing settings for the model inside of a database, and then we store the answers, the prompts, and the responses inside the database, and we can use all those things that are in the database to populate the ChromaDB vector store, so that as I ask a question, all those things can be considered, including, for example, like if I want to store the history of every interaction I've ever had with the virtual agronomist, it can use that as more context to understand how I generally ask questions, how I generally want responses. So I'm not continually telling it, I would like a response in this kind of a format, or there's a lot of people have gotten really good at telling ChatGPT how they would like to be talked to.
Sure.
One of the early features before they introduced GPTs was that ability to have like a pretext that you would put in front of it, like always talk to me like always talk to me as a pirate. Was a thing you could put in there, and no matter how you talk to ChatGPT, it always gave you answers, talking like a pirate.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned just briefly there is this idea of temperature. And for somebody who's not familiar with this, generally that's thought of as maybe like how creative
how
the
creative
model
it could
is.
be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So it's like, is it spicy or not? I think was a joke that you guys used.
We would create those models like with different temperatures inside of the system, and we would give them names. So if for the Star Trek fans in the room, we were using next generation characters as the names of our various like instances of the same model. So you could think of Lieutenant Data as being very, very just about the facts, not very
Right.
creative with the responses. Where Worf for Yar might be a little more fiery about like their responses, or Riker might be very creative with how he's going to solve a problem.
Yeah, I thought your top number was Q. You're not sure if you want to believe this one or not.
Right, very chaos oriented.
Yeah. So kind of taking a few steps back, let's talk a little bit about the project that people can kind of check out. And again, we'll include it in the show notes and people can learn a little more about it. And then you have a video that shows not only you talking a little bit about what you were working with Bex Hybrids, but also about this specific project so people can kind of check it out.
Yeah.
It was about a conference that was happening in Indianapolis about that time.
Mm-hmm.
And you had built an example based upon the information that was there and then kind of used it as a resource. So maybe you can explain it a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. So the conference was the Rally conference. It was the first year for this conference here in Indianapolis. It was kind of the South by Southwest Interactive of the Midwest. It was kind of that was kind of its goal, if you were to kind of give it a comparison to something else in the world that people might know. But given it was its first year and it had an incredible lineup of speakers, really, great. If they're doing it again this year, I highly recommend folks, who are nearby or even consider flying in, come to this conference, because it was really fun. But the UI for their conference website was a little bit not easy to use. Like the user experience was.
As somebody who builds tools like this, you want to say other words. Right. I can hear you.
It was adequate, but I thought it'd be an interesting, compelling use case for our demo would be, what if we just like index all the speakers and speaker bios, all the talks, all the talk descriptions, the schedule, like when and where, what room everything is in, and basically pull that into our vector database, and then that can swap out the backend large language model on the backside to demonstrate all these various like things I'm talking about, so they're more concrete to the end user. So we built that's what's in this repository. We built like text extractors to give people examples of, well, we're going to spider the website with like I can't remember if we use Scrapey or
it looked like it was Beautiful Soup,
or maybe Beautiful
initially.
Soup. Yeah, it was nothing super like sophisticated. So you could obviously get way more sophisticated with this is kind of maybe a reference model version of a spider, where just go to the speakers page, go to every speaker page and grab some text based on some CSS selector. And we just want to strip out HTML and just get the straight text version of these things so that we can feed that into the various models as context, the additional context windows. It made for a really good demonstration, because obviously you're sitting in the room and you can say, I think one of the demos I gave was, tell me about this conference rally. Where is it happening? And be like, oh, Indianapolis, Indiana, Convention Center, these dates. Give me a list of, the top speakers I should go, like top 10 speakers I should listen to. It gives you a list of like kind of top 10 based on the feature they had on the homepage. So everything's like checking out. And then you can be like, well, is Calvin Hendryx-Parker a speaker at this conference? And be like, yeah, absolutely. Calvin Hendryx-Parker is a speaker. He'll be speaking on Thursday in this room at this time on this topic. And I go, tell me all the large language or AI talks that are going to be at the conference. And it'll list you off any talk that had something somewhat related to artificial intelligence on there. What got more interesting was if you were an attendee of the conference, I thought it'd be interesting, and I think the more conferences should offer this, is given who I am, it knows my bio because I was one of the speakers. So I kind of had a little bit of an advantage there because the model knew about me because I was speaking in as part of the context window.
It's got some of your background there.
Yeah, exactly. There's my bio. So based on my bio, who should I go network with at this conference and why? And it was really felt great to get cool. And sometimes it gives you really great answers, and sometimes it just gave you a weirdly weird list. But when it works, and this is the early days for large language models, when it worked, it would tell you, well, you should go talk to these 5 people. And then here's what you should talk to them about, because they're, this one's doing, startups and new tech, or doing climate tech, or they're doing something with Python. And so it got these really relevant people I should go network with. And I literally used it to go track people down during this various like social events to like talk to them.
That's fun. So you did this prior to it happening?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. One of the things that is part of that process, we mentioned the sort of scraping the data out, and of course then it's going to be filled with HTML and CSS and all this other kind of stuff. You have to kind of scrub and clean and find the right selections of things that you want. Is then you need to sort of populate this. In this case, again, I think you're using ChromaDB, which seems to be a very popular choice for this. And you need to, quote unquote, vectorize the whole data.
Yeah.
And I find that topic really interesting. And I'd forgotten that we have a article on Real Python about it, which is really cool. There's a whole article that's called Embeddings and Vector Databases with ChromaDB by one of our newer authors, Harrison Hoffman. It came out in November. I think it's a great tour of that stuff. But what's interesting is you get a lot of choices with that type of thing. If it's just words, in this case, a website, if you're not doing anything with the images or any of that sort of stuff, it's fairly straightforward. You can kind of go through and just say, use this way to vectorize it. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, or what kind of tool that you use to do the actual vectorizing. Did you use something that was built into ChromaDB, or did you use a separate tool?
Yeah. In the demo, we just used something built into ChromaDB for it. I think it's more important to get the right text in there so you don't end up with a lot of extra noise in the process.
Okay.
Because we're trying to guide the LLM to give back good quality answers. And it, by default, will never, if you've ever experienced this, you'll know, it never gives back the same answer twice. You can ask it the same question 100 times, and you'll get 100 different answers that are closely related, some of them good and some of them bad. And the more, this is like where the kind of the prompt engineering comes in, is the better you can split up your content into these databases so that it can be more effectively queried. And you have to kind of strike that balance between granularity and kind of how much content you want to send into the models, and the context windows, and the number of tokens you want to spend, because that all can relate to the cost of those kinds of queries as well.
Yeah.
So, knowing what to send in, it's like you have to know, it's like a reverse engine in reverse. Like, how do you give back relevant results is by putting in the right relevant content, as opposed to like an indexer. It's just going to index the whole page necessarily.
Yeah.
But the whole page may not be important.
Okay.
And so it's understanding, because in this case, because your application, and that the content always falls here, you're going to want to like scrape out those specific parts. And you may actually want to split that up even further if you've got like a big PDF. Maybe you've got chapters as a logical breaking point, or there's some other natural way to chunk the data into one of those databases, so that you can now leverage the query against the ChromaDB vector database to give you back the right relevant chunks at the right time.
So you need to kind of define the chunks a little bit, like these are the talks, these are the speakers, or like sort of keywords in a way, like thinking of like a dictionary, a simple data structure.
Right.
Is that part of that process?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And even if you, for example, I think in that specific conference, the talks weren't called talks. Maybe they were called sessions,
Okay.
or maybe they also called them keynotes in some cases. So you also want to make sure that as you're writing the application on the back end, you're filling in that gap for the end users so that they know, or they don't have to know the difference between a talk, a keynote, a workshop, and a panel
Yeah.
are really all the same thing they're looking
I
for.
think you talked about that, about being presenters
Yeah,
versus
right.
speakers or whatever. Yeah.
Speakers,
Yeah.
exactly, or panelists, or
Panelists. Yeah.
whatever. What words are equivalent, and
Okay.
you'll lay some framework or guidance to the language model in your prompts for those kinds of things too. So in addition to bringing in stuff from the vector database, you'll bring in your own data mapping or data dictionary of like, remember, a speaker is a panelist, is a keynote, is a
Right.
these are all the same thing. So when you say give me back a list of speakers, it doesn't give you back just people who were ever labeled as a speaker. It also gives you back the panelists and the keynote speaker and
Okay.
what the workshop facilitator, or whatever other words it was used for that. So the way you can try and build in, again, more kind of guardrails to get a more comprehensive answer as opposed to a partial answer sometimes, and sometimes it'll know that maybe the facilitator was a speaker, but it doesn't give it to you consistently. So you're kind of defensively prompting the tool behind the scenes when all the user asks for is, give me a list of speakers.
So are you doing that? Like, where are you entering that information? Like, where do you sort of build your thesaurus of stuff there?
It could be in different places. I mean, you may want to build a little bit of a tool around like Django or a Flask or something like that, where you store it in a database, and then depending on the context being called back, you may query that database for additional, like these additional equivalencies or thesauruses. For the demo, I think we just, because the amount of content we were indexing was relatively small.
Okay.
Like I think the new models can take the whole context window of everything we were doing all at once. It wouldn't matter. We could have just fed the whole thing all the time. But if you didn't want to like have that overhead and cost, because it still costs, like you pay by the token. So even though what ChatGPT 4 can do, like 100,000 token window, context window, you're going to pay for it to use 100,000 tokens, and that's going to be expensive.
Right.
So
It's a bigger machine running in the background there.
right. So you still may want to tune your application to only return so many documents out of the ChromaDB database, so you're not overflowing that context window with potentially irrelevant information or less important information. You want to grab the most important, most relevant documents that you're sending along. And same thing for these kind of instructions. So in our case for the demo, if you look at the demo code, there's in that repository, you'll just see it in like the main function where we're
Okay.
basically showcasing. We built a command line tool using prompt-toolkit,
Okay.
which is also really fun. If you've not played with prompt-toolkit, so it has auto completion. So it'll auto complete like speaker or session or words it knows about that are we've fed into prompt-toolkit, but it also keeps the history of everything your prompt has ever like you've ever typed into it. So like if you're using like Bash or ZSH, you've got your shell history where you can up arrow. Prompt-toolkit gives you the same thing, and we leverage that same history to feed it in as additional context. So you have like a memory to the discussion. So now as you feed the next prompt into the command line, it's aware of all the previous prompts you've ever asked for, and it uses that to pick out the right documents from the vector database to feed them into the context window, and away you go. But the hard code, you'll see in there kind of a hard coding of when you're responding, keep these things in mind. The speaker is the same thing as a facilitator or a workshop panelist.
Okay. So that's one potential context as you're exploring something, and maybe
Yeah.
as you need a larger solution, you might build some other kind of architectural solution for that.
Yeah, and these are pretty, I mean, custom fit, unique solutions. I think
Yeah.
anybody can go pick up the Chat GPT or the GPT API and make a query and a call, but you're going to get wildly different kind of things coming back out of it because you're not even protected by the guardrails that ChatGPT gives you. Like if you're using ChatGPT, you've got some additional bits kind of working in your favor to help guide the experience to make it more of a consumer friendly tool. If you're just using the API, you're more. I guess it's more on you to try and do the right behaviors or send the right kind of queries in to get the best kind of answers back.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I remember talking about prompt-toolkit is generally a CLI tool, but like it's such a interesting tool for this circumstance.
Yeah.
It really kind of comes in handy.
Well, yeah, because you could have it query and autocomplete, and it's again, it's a really nice thing for building quick and dirty little command line, or not even quick and dirty, but like production level
Yeah.
command line tools for people.
So going back to the Bex hybrids, the documentation, and you talked about, sort of the struggle there.
Oh yeah.
In that one, you have a lot more complex documentation. And so it looks like you used a different tool in that case. You were using, was it Llama Index, or what is it called?
Oh, we did. We started off that project with Llama Index. I think if we were doing it again, we probably wouldn't.
Okay.
We probably would just stick with LangChain like we were. It was because it was so early days.
You were trying lots of things.
Yeah, we're trying lots of different things and seeing which ones are giving us best results. And
Okay.
I think the community and the kind of world settled on getting behind LangChain as a great tool.
Okay.
And it got tricky early too, because for example, Llama Index and LangChain, and we were using Simon Willison's LLM library as well, and some of them had conflicting dependencies. So, actually, if you look at the demo code, this has not been updated since last summer, but there are 2 virtual environments it'll set up so that it can install different versions of a couple packages because they've just everyone's moving fast, and some people were pinned to old versions of something and hadn't upgraded, and others had. So the struggle is real when it comes to Python packaging, as everyone knows. But keeping dependencies up to date is not a problem that is unique to large language models. It's a problem unique to it's a global problem for everybody to keep your dependencies up to date.
And even worse for trying to provide resources for people to learn from. It's a struggle we have every day, as far as writing tutorials and things like that at Real Python. We struggle with it too. In this area, just multiply by 10, how fast it's moving and so forth. Because I brought up some tutorials today just to kind of mess around with some of these things.
Yeah.
And big red flags would appear like, deprecated. I'm like, all right, well, what do which direction should I go? Yeah, so everything was just trying to seeing if it'll work in other ways. But yeah, it's nice to have things pinned, even though that might not be the latest things. At least you can kind of get to the end of it and then maybe think about how to modernize it.
We'll have a whole nother talk on approaches to keeping your environments up to date in a sane manner.
Yeah, definitely. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It dives deeper into one of the tools we mentioned this week. It's titled Command Line Interfaces in Python, and it's based on a Real Python article by Andre Bourgault. In the course, instructor Liam Pulsifer explains the details behind implementing your own command line interfaces in Python and how they can process a variety of arguments. You learn about the origins of Python command line arguments, the built-in support for CLIs in Python, standards behind designing a CLI, how to manually customize and handle arguments, and you'll learn about several libraries available in Python that can ease in developing a complex CLI. These include argparse, getup, click, and the one that we mentioned this week, prompt-toolkit. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to learn how to implement your own command line interface and how to handle a variety of arguments to make them flexible and more useful to the users of your Python projects. Like most of the video courses on Real Python, the course is broken into easily consumable sections. You get code examples for the technique shown, and all of our courses have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the search tool on realpython.com. So you talked a little bit about the data that they have is a lot of it's text. You also talked about in your talk that there's going to be tables in there, which is an interesting data structure right in the middle of a text document for it to try to parse. Like, do you end up parsing that separately or in quote unquote indexing it separately, like using a different tool, or like how do you approach that? Like, or do you just excise it? Or?
Well, so the difficult part with the tables was if they were using, for example, visual elements to denote some importance in the table.
Sure.
Or if you had like a footnote
like conditional formatting or something.
Or if like there's an asterisk on something.
Sure.
Well, in the footnotes, way down the page necessarily, and there's nothing super formal about the footnotes. I guess as humans, it's easy for us to understand. We see a superscript 1. We go to the back of the book and try and find like what that citation was, and then
Triple
go
double
follow
dagger.
it. Exactly, and so it's easy. It's for humans, we take it for granted, but for the parsing of that text, like the proximity of the text to one another is important.
Okay.
For the models as they're indexing and understanding or trying to give you back responses that statistically make sense. If something was far apart on a page, like just physically distanced far apart on a page, they may not be considered related to one another.
Yeah.
So we had to look for those kinds of aspects of, if a table was in the middle of the page, we may use a technique to understand what the visual look of the page is, so we could basically slice it up in different ways and then try and rebuild the page in a more computer friendly or machine readable friendly version of that content. So restructuring back pieces that were maybe farther apart from one another, and again using like AI to be able to tear a page apart and then put it back together.
Okay. Yeah, because I look at this process of indexing, and there's models that are, luckily have done a lot of the work for you. An index, it's going to build this vector relationship, and that vector that's in the database for the particular whatever token it's looking at could have 300 fields. It could have
Right.
50. It could have like this real like deep relationships depending on what the model is that you're using in advance. So I don't know if you want to get into the weeds of that sort of stuff, but like, were you looking at like, okay, I want to have 300 vectors, or I want to look at or fields or whatever? Were those some of the things that you were looking at and doing this for this project?
Yeah, because we want to be able to feed all the information in a way that we could make the queries on the other side make sense to feed into the model. So
Okay.
yeah, you're right. Like deciding how granular to get decides how big the vector space actually is.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
you can tune those queries against the vector space to give you back more or less items, because you may bleed into another topic really easily if your query space is too large or the documents are too few.
Yeah, I feel like you're opening up another, like, all right, we need another dashboard over here that's going to have all these extra controls. Like, do you want to have that many controls or not? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why all these projects are pretty unique. I mean, and they all look, the part that's like unclear to people is it all looks like a chat box. Like your interface to most all these tools right now generally
Right.
is a chat box, and that looks the same whether you're talking to ChatGPT or you've built some virtual agronomist.
Right.
And so the behind the scenes is all very different, but the UI and the user experience for all of them is all this almost identical, which it can be deceiving. That was what I was looking for. There's a very deceiving simplicity
Right.
to the chat box UI. And I think that's why ChatGPT obviously took off, because it gave people access to these GPT tools that were already out there, and you could build your own bits around it. But a chat box UI just like sent that thing into the stratosphere because it was so easy to use for us, because we're so used to messaging with someone and getting a response back.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, texting and
Yeah.
whatever, and, dealing with customer service and all these other kind of simplified agents,
I find
Yeah.
the customer service one an interesting one. I can't tell you how many times I avoid a chat box on a website
Yeah.
for customer service, because it's going to be some dumb bot that just has a decision tree and usually has no idea what I'm talking about.
Right.
But this now changes things, right? Like it can understand like what I've asked, and I can recall to a previous ticket, and these models can now go look that up. Like with LangChain, you can build tools that can use APIs and go and access like all this wealth of information and give the end user actually a great experience, like a delightful experience, as opposed to a frustrating, no, those 3 documents you just linked to do not actually answer my question. I would love for the day when it actually says, it gives me back one document and it's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah.
But I've yet to see it happen on a standard customer service site.
Yeah. It'd be nice. Like, I was thinking about a question, I'm trying to figure out how to word it, but like, you talked about the idea of like prompt engineering, and how it's an art form. And literally, people are joking that that's going to be the future job or whatever. And what I wonder about with building a tool for a customer, because that's mainly what you guys do, is you're consultancy, and you also build stuff and create things, but often you have to figure out like how to ask the right questions. And I'm wondering about like, how do you do that for a customer? Like, how do you train the customer to be a better prompt engineer? Are there guardrails that you can put in there, boxes in there, like the thing you just mentioned, like that you could ask if it was a chat tool? They could say, are you coming back from a previous
Right.
customer support thing? Okay, could you put in your ticket? And then it would load up your whole like history, which would be awesome. You're right, because it sucks to repeat all that.
There's a lot of opportunity, a lot of money still on the table, I think,
Yeah,
for building these kind of better tools and better experiences.
yeah,
It may be that people aren't the next. I don't know. Maybe I'm just thinking about the future here.
that's okay.
That everyone's building similar products, but the one that may win may actually be the one that has a better customer service experience, because it actually can answer your questions and you feel good about the experience, as opposed to,
Right.
oh my gosh, I mean, the last time I've chatted with my bank's chatbot, it's just an agonizingly frustrating experience.
Yeah, like actually taking.
I won't tell you what my bank is. That way you don't go.
But it's a big one. No,
Yeah.
No, I hear you. I think that's true. Like, I think that, and this leads to a question that I was going to ask you already, this idea of asking the right questions. And
Yeah.
I feel like customer experience, how do you want this to feel for a customer? Like, what do you want that experience to be like? Who is this for? Is this for this business leader, for them to look cool and them to have this new toy that's out there and they can, announce it or whatever? Or are they trying to save time and make it easier for the agents? Or are we going to feed them to a secondary thing? Like, there's all these kind of questions you need to kind of like figure out to sort of flow chart them into the right direction.
Exactly. Well, knowing your audience, like you said,
Yeah.
is it a CEO looking for an answer, or is it a customer service agent looking for an answer, or is it a consumer
Right.
who's technically savvy looking for an answer versus like one who's less savvy? I mean, I think we've all experienced this. There's some people in this world who are really good at using a search engine. Like, there's some people who their Google foo is off the chart. You're like, how did you find like that needle in the haystack when you're searching Google?
Right.
And there's some people who are, you're like, how did you not find it? Like, you just type, let me Google that for you was a great
exactly.
meme from back in the day, because you like, someone would be like, I can't find blah 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 blah, and you'd be like, send them a let me Google that for you link, because apparently your Google foo is better. I think the prompts engineering is similar. There are some people who get a lot of value out of Chat GPT because they're really good at having that conversation.
Right.
Like, they really understand the thing on the other side of this is not a person. The thing on the other side of this is a system, and the thing on the other side of this chat box understands me in a certain way, right? And
Right.
And if I can talk to it with knowing like who I'm talking to, even though it's a model,
it likes specificity.
Right? It's a model.
Yeah.
It's not a person. Like
it doesn't care if you're redundant. It
right?
doesn't
Yeah,
care.
exactly. It doesn't care. You can be over redundant. It's over explicit. Like, you can say this is very, 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 very important, and it's gonna look for right.
Right.
The latest podcast I was listening to that Simon Wilson was on, he said he would regularly just tell the model to do better. Like, he would ask a question and then he'd be like, do better.
Yeah, I saw one like that too, that it answered something and the guy, it said, well, I can't do this, and then the person just wrote back, bro.
Right,
and then it popped out the correct answer.
You could be like, try again. You'd be like, come on. You can do this. Give it a little encouragement, make it feel okay. But it's understanding that exactly that. So I think some people are really good about that, and some people will just have a hard time with it. It's a social skill, even though you're not talking to another human.
Yeah. Thinking about, like, if you were going to do this for another client, you have a lot you've learned in this process.
Yeah.
And I see that, that this is like a focus for 6 Feet Up. You guys are looking at things to do in this domain. What are questions that you ask now of a new client that help to narrow that stuff? How do you find to ask the right questions of like, well, what do I need to build for them, and how to create it?
I think sometimes you also want to make sure, do they even need this?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
discovering vector databases through this whole journey, and it's actually opened our eyes to the fact that the vector databases themselves by alone are actually really, really powerful. Like
Okay.
they be able to get back really relevant results really, really fast. That was a really key bit.
It's interesting. It's like a different form of relations in a
Yeah.
relational database. It's this weird interrelationship between rows and things like that, and items there. I find that really fascinating.
Yeah.
I've had so many people like, I am so excited about vectors. I'm so excited. And I'm like, I always just like kind of scratch my head. And now I'm seeing it. Like now with
You're
this
right.
technology, I'm getting a
It
better.
took the right YouTube. It took the right YouTube video to explain to me like the whole transformers,
Yeah.
bit. And now I'm like, oh, like there's a lot of there's a lot of
Yeah.
power in here because it adds some levels of understanding on proximities, and it's not just a simple search anymore.
Yeah.
So that's where first thing I'd start with is, are we heading down the right path? Are we just trying to apply technology for technology's sake? Does everything look like a nail if all we got is a hammer?
Right.
Because that's not what we build. It's just hammers. Like we build all kinds of crazy tools all over the place for all kinds of different people. So it's getting down to also understanding costs, because like you could spend a lot of money to solve the same problem and not really get better results necessarily.
Yeah.
Like if you were going to, like I mentioned earlier, if you're going to fine tune a model as opposed to just using the RAG technique, you can spend a lot of money and a lot of time on the fine tuning and not really get maybe even better results, maybe even get worse results because you don't have that capability of adjusting those context windows on the fly for new data that has entered the system.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting, and then potentially leaving them with a bad experience or bad taste in their mouth. It's not going to help your company at all.
No,
It's like
no.
you got one big win, if you will, a contract, but it definitely doesn't set up stuff for the future.
Right. So again, I think there's a lot of people out there who know how to call an API. There's not as many people who know how to do all the trimmings around it and have the observability and that like following the journey of a user and understanding what they want and getting the most out of the tools.
One story that came up in the news recently that I just want to mention, and I wonder if it gives you pause in suggesting things like this to a business, is this Air Canada chatbot thing. I don't know if you...
I saw that.
Yeah. It's kind of a wild example. And I think of ways that they could have avoided this problem. But generally, like, if people aren't familiar with this person was traveling and it was a bereavement sort of situation. And they asked the chatbot, like, how do I take advantage of a bereavement sort of fair? Like, and the chatbot said, oh, you can just travel now and you can ask for a refund later, which is not what's there. It did provide a link to a document that went further, but that felt like a pretty definitive answer to that person. And anyway, it turned into like a whole lawsuit and was handled in the government. And then what's kind of crazy is Air Canada's reaction, in my opinion, which I think they just said, we're just not going to use this thing anymore. And I'm like, well, how much did it cost to create it?
Their initial reaction was that the model the agent, the large language model was an independent entity acting on its own.
Oh yeah.
And it was not, they were not responsible for what it was saying. I was like, but you all told it what to do.
Right.
And also like a little bit of my commentary on that specific story. If you think about what that model is trying to do, is trying to say the next statistically probable thing back to the end user.
Right.
The policy to let someone travel and use a bereavement discount afterwards seems like it makes sense to me. And it obviously
I think it's fine. It totally seems like an okay thing to do. But
so the model made basically kind of poked at their policy is like, your policy actually doesn't make sense. Like that should not be that would not be the same thing to do. I just said the same thing.
Is this a better answer?
Because why are you trying to rip off this person who's traveling for a funeral for a bereavement?
Right, they're going through some stuff right now. Yeah,
why would you ever do that?
This is not a very Canadian thing to be doing.
No, definitely not. Right, exactly. You should be like, act like a Canadian, like
Yeah. But it's weird. Then they just said, all right, we're just going to shut the thing off, and I'm like, okay, well, I mean, I'm sure there would be ways that they could have addressed it, and we talked about FAQs and things like that, or other directions, but it just kind of weird thing. I just wonder if it gives you like pause a little bit and like suggesting this to a business.
But there's been these all hit the headlines and they're all pretty fantastic news sound bites, right? Like the car dealership that was, the people were asking to sell them a car for $1 and, no takesy backsies type thing. But it's because it was unsophisticated users deploying a very sophisticated tool that has lots of facets and aspects and can do things that are unpredictable, but you have to really wrangle it in onto what you want it to do. So I think that I can't speak for their development teams, or maybe someone in marketing just put on a credit card and cut and pasted a snippet into the site to make this thing like active as a trial, but they obviously didn't think through, how humans, think about these kind of problems and how humans would approach a text box, a random text box there, and ask innocent questions. And the fact that that text box is trained on all the knowledge of the internet. And if all the knowledge of if every other airline in the world, their policy is just submit a refund request after the fact, well, then obviously it's going to answer most likely to do that.
This is the common answer.
This is the common answer. And that's exactly what they're doing. And you can tell it, here's our policies, adhere to them strictly, do not waver. If you think, if your confidence is not high to respond in a certain way, immediately, put a real human being in that loop.
Right, exactly.
As part of the process.
Right.
So I don't know what, I can't speak for what
we can't speak to it. And we're just seeing a news report on it.
We're just seeing a news report. And it's kind of unfortunate that their response to it was, I guess, it didn't give people a good feeling about it. Like the fact they just took it down.
Right.
Or the fact that they denied that it was acting on their behalf as an agent of their airline. Like, you put this there. Like,
exactly.
The LLM did not the LLM did not hack your system and put this like chat box on your website.
Yeah, exactly. It's so wild. One of the things I wonder about, and I know we're kind of running a little bit short on time, but how do you stay up to date on these topics? Like, are there resources that you like? You mentioned podcasts there, like, or following a particular person. Simon seems like I need to get him on the show.
Simon's a great one. If you aren't following Simon's blog, he is just every day experimenting with these tools. He's trying to break them in unique ways. He's showing you fun and unique things he's doing. I forget. We'll have to put a link to that last podcast that I mentioned where he talked about just do it better. It was a really great episode because he really kind of explained the state of, and actually he's given this talk a couple times over the last years, like the state of LLMs and the state of generative AI, and things like the prompt attacks have not been solved. He's really forward and upfront about the fact that this is not a solved problem. They've not figured out how to put in the right guardrails or things to keep people from making these kinds of attacks against the prompts themselves. So I keep up with that. I definitely follow his blog. I definitely follow numerous podcasts, and also to keep myself, a little bit on the paranoid side. One of my favorite podcasts is the Darknet Diaries.
Okay,
if you've ever listened to that one, there's not specifically LLM or generative AI content on there, but if you want to understand how human brains can go off the rails and do potentially nefarious things, those stories are really great for kind of just getting a little bit of a feel for what people can do if you're thinking about deploying one of these chatbots yourself.
Maybe I'll ask you to share via email like a good starting point or something like that.
Oh yeah, sure.
And then we can include a link. You can say, hey, start with these episodes, because I know it's been around for a while.
Yeah, and there's a couple of newsletters I'm on. Let's see here. Let me look them up real quick. I've recently moved over to Omnivore for all of my it's like, Pocket, where you could read it later, or Instapaper.
Oh, okay.
Omnivore is an open source one, but what's kind of cool is it supports RSS feeds. So I can basically feed it my RSS feeds. I can also put it in the browser and just click on it and say, read this later, which is the old, standard functionality.
So it's got a little plug-in button thing.
Yeah, it's a little plug-in button. And the other nice thing is I've cleaned up recently my inbox and unsubscribed from all the newsletters and actually subscribe to the ones I care about and put them into Omnivore, because Omnivore gives you these little, temporary or one-time unique email addresses that you can go sign up for things, and then
it can
populates them right in here. And so the feeds feature of Omnivore with the emails is so nice. I was going to say I've got a couple on here that are probably relevant and very interesting, which is the TLDR AI newsletter. If you aren't part of the TLDR newsletter, they've got an AI sub newsletter that is actually quite interesting.
Okay.
The Tech Brew newsletter is also really good.
Okay. Nice. Great. I appreciate that. I think it's hard to stay on top of all this stuff.
Oh, it is. There's so much news.
And I wonder about covering it sometimes here. I like our angle here. You have a nice project that our listeners can go and check out and play with, and then we're trying to provide as many resources to kind of link out to have people get in here and then think about it.
Yeah. When you can get hands to the keyboard and actually play with these tools, it makes a big difference than just like hearing it in your, listen to it on a podcast or reading a blog post. I want to go code and play, change some things and see what it does.
It's intriguing how much of the work is built into the libraries, and you kind of switch gears a little bit as a primary Python coder, and you kind of become a little more of a data scientist in the sense that you're now doing the tweaking a little more and adjusting parameters, and which is a different mode for a lot of us who are kind of more Python coders that are interested in this topic and this idea.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm not, my background is not data science. And so when I grab tools like pandas, it feels a little foreign to me.
Yeah.
Like I'm not used to like vector math and those kinds of things. That's not, I've done web development, web applications, or even data pipelines. But when I grab a data frame, I'm actually getting much more comfortable now thinking like that and like, how can I make this faster by using some kind of vector math to like, do this all in memory and manipulate that and this, and then get whole new sets of data, out of a data frame. It's really, really powerful, but it's not my default like way of thinking.
Yeah, totally. So I have these recurring questions. I'd like to ask everybody, what's something you're excited about in the world of Python?
I'm excited about PyCon this year.
Okay, you're heading out to Pittsburgh this year?
Yeah, I'll be at Pittsburgh this year. It'll be my 20th PyCon in a row.
Oh wow,
that I've been to. So I'm.
That's a pretty good record.
I only missed one. I missed the first one. But that wasn't even doing Python yet, I don't think. So 21 years ago, I wasn't doing Python, and 20 years ago I was.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to PyCon.
Are you presenting or doing anything?
No, not this year. I was going to try and participate in the packaging summit that's happening there. I'll be bringing my...
That's going to be very interesting.
I'm looking forward to it. I hope that... cross my fingers they accept me in as a participant. And maybe this will give enough pull, so we'll see. I'm also bringing my 16-year-old to PyCon. He's gotten really into hacking and making and creating.
Oh, cool.
He actually ported an app someone made at their school. It was in Node.js. He ported it over to Django because he wanted to be able to add in like users and groups and have a single sign-on to like Active Directory. And I was like, well, you should use Django. And he came back a day later and he'd used ChatGPT as his co-pilot and ported the whole thing, Django templates and all, into Django. And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine if I had this kind of tools and cool stuff available to me when I was 16. Like, yeah. So he's gonna come to PyCon. He actually got pretty excited about that. I offered it, not knowing whether there'd be an interest in going to like a professional Python conference as a 16-year-old. Sure. And he was like, yeah. I was like, I went and booked the ticket right away. I didn't ask twice.
That's cool. Awesome.
So I'm excited about PyCon. What else in the Python world? All the like LangChain stuff is really, really exciting. There's so much cool stuff going on. I also like all the infrastructure things that are going on. So it's hard to pinpoint just one thing for me.
Yeah.
Also, I'm doing less and less of like the down in the weeds, coding on a day-to-day basis. But another thing I'm finding, the LLM library from Simon's really fun to play with. It's really easy to get started with and use on the command line. So definitely check that out. I know I'm like, I must be like Simon's like biggest fan, like fan club president now. But
it's totally fine. Yeah.
he's putting together really good content.
He's doing the work.
He is.
Yeah, that's great. What's something that you want to learn next? It doesn't have to be about programming.
Well, before we got on, I've got a couple synthesizers sitting here on my desk in front of me, and I really, really want to play with them and start making some music.
Yeah.
My oldest has been playing guitar now for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. And he kind of maybe inspired me to go pick up and start fiddling with some instruments and music. So I'm kind of excited about that.
Cool.
That's something I'd like to learn, is more about the synths and sequencers and, all the oscillators and modulation stuff that goes on in there. It's really...
Did we talk about this last time?
I learned about
that tool called Syntorial. Was that one
no,
that
wasn't me. So
that's a iOS app that takes you through it. It creates a sound and then does like this A/B test. Like, okay, well, which one did we create?
Oh, nice.
And then it has you like with an interface like create it. And so it has a, a virtual,
for creating like your own
synthesizer.
patches.
Yeah, for creating patches, like, okay, create this type of patch and create this type of patch, and does it match? And it's an interesting tutorial system, and it's a paid thing. There's a free, like set of lessons, but I found it interesting. And as somebody who's, I know a lot of this information, but synthesizers have actually gotten more complex over time, since the 80s. But there's still a lot of core, fundamental ideas, attack, decay, the whole envelope stuff. And then, but I'm fascinated by that stuff. So I thought that was a really neat resource if you're interested.
I'll have to check it out.
So,
I would definitely check it out.
Okay, cool. I always ask this question, but how can people, what's the best way for them to follow your work online?
I'm on Twitter or X as Calvin HP.
Okay.
Probably the best place I'm actually putting more, will be putting more content is going to be on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or follow me on LinkedIn. I'm going to start trying to record at least something once a week.
Okay.
Which is kind of thoughts, real quick snippets and stuff. So that's a good spot. And then you can always check out the 6feet blog. So 6feet.com/blog. We're, about once a month putting something up there of interest to developers.
One of the things that we've talked about a couple times over the years is IndyPy and your involvement there.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about, upcoming stuff with that? Because you seem to be pretty involved in there.
Yeah. So I don't know if this will be out by then or not, but next week is our next hybrid event. So we've been moving to a quarterly hybrid in-person and virtual event. And next week's is going to actually be related to the upcoming eclipse, since it's coming over Indiana. We're in the direct path of the solar eclipse coming up. So we have a speaker who's going to talk about Python and the eclipse and astronomy and physics. He's super passionate about that kind of stuff. When I first talked to him, he does another job. Like his day job is not this stuff, but when he starts talking about astronomy and physics, like you could just see him light up. And so I was like, you need to come speak at IndyPy.
Yeah.
So next month, if this goes out afterwards, the recording will be up.
It'll probably come out afterwards.
Yeah, the recording will be up on YouTube from that session. So go to the IndyPy YouTube channel, and you can pick up the recording for that. I haven't seen it yet, but I can guarantee you it'll be a fun presentation.
Nice.
And then look for next Q3 will be our next hybrid event. Feel free to sign up since we are trying to cater to people who can be in person and also online. We've been really good at trying to make sure that people online have a reasonable experience for our meetups, because over the pandemic, we gained quite an audience.
That's great. Yeah. Your example that we were going to be sharing from today's episode here, there's lots of questions you're grabbing from the people online. So there's a lot of interaction.
Oh, yeah. That was a recent one we did. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Calvin, it's always great to talk to you. Thanks for coming on the show again.
Yeah. Thanks, Christopher.
All right. Talk to you soon. And don't forget, this episode was brought to you by Mailtrap, an email delivery platform that developers love. Try it out for free at mailtrap.io. I want to thank Calvin Hendryx-Parker for coming on the show again this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python Podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python Podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.